start off with a panel like this saying it's a pleasure to moderate a panel like this, but unfortunately this is a really heavy topic, talking about the links between child labor and forced labor here in the United States, the world's richest country. And I think what we're going to do today is try to, in just the space of an hour, use the resources and expertise of a really terrific panel we have here, made up of civil society advocates, data providers, business experts, and other service providers, to help all of us better understand the nature of this challenge here in the United States, but more importantly, to also focus not just on where this risk is and try to begin to approach this problem of child labor and recruitment abuse in the United States as something that's new and something that people have to sort out whether or not they're associated with it, but rather to face it squarely as a deep and systemic problem. That's not just something that happens to be noted by a New York Times reporter in February, Hannah Dreier. I'm hoping that many of you have read her expose, Finding Children 11, 12, I think even 10 years old, deep in American supply chains. This is a deep systemic problem that's not just a matter of a quirk in either a Trump or Biden administration border policy approach, but rather something that's deeply embedded in American supply chains. And I think it's important with a group like this that has focused for many years on recruitment abuse and the links of forced labor to acknowledge how, even though it's easy for us or typical for groups to focus on adults, whether they're the seafarers we've been hearing about this morning or adult workers who are migrating to, say, Qatar and facing death by heat in the desert or facing years and years of paying off their debt to get out of bondage, that many children are also migrants with their parents, but often alone. That's certainly the case here in the United States, and we need to acknowledge that. And so it's really important to have this time to expand our notion of forced labor to see how it's connected to some other fundamental abuses and labor rights like freedom from child labor, in addition to issues around conditions of work or freedom from discrimination that's more common for us to talk about in these fora. It's great that we do have all of our panelists in person, and so hopefully that'll make it a little bit easier for everybody, and certainly for our colleagues who deal with the complicated tech issues of having a global online forum. But I did also just wanted to note it was really powerful yesterday when Maritza courageously talked about the situation she faced here in the United States as a young person, but as an adult. And obviously, we really need to acknowledge the fact that the children here in the United States who have been victims of these abuses and forced labor cannot and should not be able to speak for themselves, right? It'd be totally inappropriate to do that, and frankly, it would be very hard to find them. And so I just really wanted to really acknowledge the fact that we're dealing with a really heavy topic here where we're not really even able to hear from the victims of this crime themselves. But we do have experts who can help us illuminate what the issue is and help us think through how to approach it. So what I'm going to do with our time is ask each of our panelists to just first briefly introduce themselves, help you see where their organization is focused as a resource provider or expert on this issue of child and forced labor in the United States, just very briefly. Then we're going to have each panelist talk about how they see in ways that their organization is approaching some of these deep structural problems related to recruitment and child labor and forced labor in the US. Then we're going to ask them to provide some insights into remedy and justice and remediation and how to deal particularly with child victims in these circumstances. And then finally, some recommendations around public policy advocacy, particularly by companies. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So why don't I first start with Diana Fimbres from the Polaris Project.
Thank you, Sean. Hi, everyone. As Sean mentioned, I am the Senior Program Manager for the Strategic Initiative on Labor Trafficking at Polaris. Polaris is an anti-trafficking organization that works to shift the systems that allow sex and labor trafficking to occur in North America, and we also operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline. On the labor trafficking team in particular, we're focused on ending the labor trafficking of migrant guest workers in the United States with a particular focus in the agricultural sector.
Great. We met Rachel Micah-Jones yesterday from CDM, but Rachel, it would be great to hear a little more about how CDM orients towards this issue.
Okay, great. So I'm Rachel Micah-Jones, and I'm the founder and executive director of Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, or CDM, the Center for Migrant Rights. And we work in Mexico and the United States to support migrant worker organizing and advocacy. We're really trying to build worker power, remove the border as a barrier to justice for workers, and fight for an alternative model to labor migration that respects workers, their communities, their families. And we do that with partners too, like Polaris and other members of Migration That Works, which is a coalition that CDM chairs. And with respect to child labor, at CDM, we've always seen cases of child labor, but usually in agriculture, and even in the H-2A program, there are minors who are recruited to work in agriculture. But more recently, we've seen cases in protein processing industries in the Delmarva Peninsula, in the automotive industry in the South, where we have cases. And so I think what we're seeing at our organization really mirrors kind of the data that we're seeing from the Department of Labor and others about the increase in child labor. And I think our approach at CDM is always really to provide a base of support to workers, ensure that there's a safety plan and a security plan in place, and that we're not putting people at risk when we approach these cases. So look forward to the next round.
Thank you. Also wanted to introduce Malin Lingert from the Center for Child Rights in Business, who's a global expert on child labor and the remediation of that.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thanks also for inviting us to this conference. It's been really interesting. So I'm Malin. I'm the Director for Consultancy Services at the Center for Child Rights and Business. We were established in China 12 years ago as a child rights organization, working directly with businesses on improving their policies and practices so they can support and uphold child rights. And into that, we have, of course, the issue of child labor prevention and remediation. We have been working on that in a number of countries in Asia. We do that through businesses that we work with. So we don't work really with governments. We work directly with businesses and their supply chains. So we work with child labor cases that are either identified by ourselves through child labor risk assessment. It can be in manufacturing industries in India, or it can be in pepper plantations in Vietnam. Or we work with child labor cases that are being referred to us by auditors that are doing audits in global supply chains. So we are not an audit companies. We come in sort of to support the brands, the suppliers, and children with a proper remediation solution. So we have been doing that for more than 10 years in Asia. We are also now expanding our services to Latin America and also to Africa. And also last year, we even remediated 5 cases here in the US. So it's nothing new to us, even though that we are also as shocked as everyone else about the scale and sort of the persistence of this phenomena in the US. So I'm based here in New York, very appropriate time, I think, to be based in the US. And I just wanted to mention one more thing. So we work on child rights, which is a broad topic, and I just wanted to go back to the discussion we had yesterday about migrant workers and to see them as a human being. And we work and have been working in countries in Asia for a long time on parenting trainings for migrant workers that are not living with their children, on how they can reconnect with the children. We train them in how to sort of detect issues that they are worried about from a distance. We empower the parents in their decision that they have left the children behind, and we do provide various kind of parenting trainings. We've done that for 10 years in hundreds of factories in Asia. And I think it's, again, this is a non-compliance issue. We are going to talk about child labor a lot, which is a compliance issue. But all of these things are linked, right? The kids that we are seeing in child labor situations are very often migrant children, one way or the other. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because I think yesterday it was really touching to hear about the migrants and get that face again, because I think we talk so much about these people, but they are actually also human beings. They are also parents like myself and many of us in the room. So I just wanted to mention that as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And of course, you've all met Louise Herring from AIM Progress, but we're eager to hear AIM Progress's perspective on this issue.
Great, thank you, Sean. So Louise Herring from AIM Progress, as I've said a couple of times, we're a collaborative forum of 44 fast-moving consumer goods companies working together on human rights. A reasonable number of our members were named in the New York Times articles, obviously, so this issue is very relevant to us. I think I just wanted to say by way of introduction that I've worked in UK food and human rights for about 15 years now, and we've been talking about forced labour as a UK-specific issue for a very long time. So to some extent, I think your introduction, you talked about, you know, this being a kind of new topic. I think certainly for me, and I think in the conversations with members, what I was relaying was, you know, in the UK there's a recognition this is a real risk. Forced labour is a real risk, not so much child labour, but it's been a risk that's been acknowledged for quite a long time. And perhaps this is, you know, for corporates in the US, just a realisation that those risks are there, a change in mindset, that a country that you perceived as being low risk actually isn't. I know we'll go into the more detail of what we're doing, but I think there was a couple of things I just wanted to touch on by way of introduction. I think one was to say that in our approach, and would welcome the kind of comments on this, we are thinking of child labour and forced labour together. So we're acknowledging that if the figures are there about increased risk of child labour, then forced labour risks are also likely to be there as well. So we're thinking about these things together. The approach that we take is to be very practical. So as an organisation, that's what we're focused on, is what can we do, what should we be doing now? And that's what we'll touch a little bit more on. But also our strength as an organisation is the ability to drive convergence across our members and to say, actually, it's most likely unhelpful if company A does one thing, company B does another thing. So when we talk about the next steps and what we're planning, a lot of it is around collaboration and convergences of approach, how you can take common messages to supply chain partners, co-packers, manufacturers, labour providers, service providers, etc., and how can you build capacity and remediate issues. So that's something I think we'll come back to. And then I think the other thing that I just really wanted to emphasise from the outset is the response that we're taking to this is very much beyond compliance. So it's not a compliance-based audit response. That was, in our conversations that we've had together, it was the week one conversation, and then we moved on to say that the solution and how we deal with this has to be beyond compliance and has to be about remediation. And I think for all of our members that's extremely important. And perhaps just to touch a little bit on scale, we are an organisation that has US-based members. We also have European-based members. So this issue is a live and active one, probably for about 50% of our members, is something that we'd expect them to be actively involved in.
Great, thank you. When we were last week talking as a panel about what we wanted to do today, we honed in on 5 or 6 structural issues that are common in recruitment abuse and common globally, right? That we wanted to share and then discuss as a panel. How people are seeing these here in the US. The things that we've been talking about for a day and a half, right? Insufficient visibility and lack of clarity around accountability within supply chains. Assumption, as Louise just mentioned, here in the United States, that it's not a country of high risk, despite a lot of evidence from many, many years. Over-reliance on labor providers and little or no accountability for those agencies. The particular vulnerabilities of these populations due to poverty, due to migration status, due to demonization in various societies where migrants go, little or no and poor, weak law enforcement, and essentially a lot of pointing of fingers or assumption that things are too complex and that people kind of throw up their hands around this problem. And so those were some of the major structural things that should be familiar to all of you from the various global forums we had in the past, but wanted to give the opportunity for each panelist to give a little bit of flavor and insight from what they're seeing around some of these structural issues. Diana?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I'd like to also just sort of ground us in the issue that, you know, child labor, we talk about as human trafficking as well. It starts with that, right? Like vulnerability is a starting point. So I think it's important that when we're thinking about how a trafficking situation happens, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think it's important to put each individual person in that context, right? Before they even leave maybe their home community if they're a migrant, right? So how do vulnerabilities compound? And I think that's an important question, that trafficking is the result of something, right? It's normally when a lot of different systems maybe have failed a person and leaves them in this completely exploitative and vulnerable situation. So I always like to point back to that because we can talk about indicators and things like that, but it's always important to ground how the individual may be vulnerable to begin with. Here in the United States and through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, we've been able to get some reports around what we call minors in labor trafficking or child labor. And part of what we're seeing, and again, this is not prevalence data by any means, but we see this across industries. So we see this in agriculture, domestic work, peddling and begging rings, and so we see it across quite a few different industries. But when we start to delve into, again, what are those vulnerabilities that we're seeing, the first one that pops up, which is no surprise, is recent migration, right? And so what, again, recent migration, how does that place an individual in this country? What does that mean, right? That means maybe barriers in language, right? It means barriers in just knowing the system around you. So that's a key element. The next vulnerability that we tend to see, which is similar to what adult victims of labor trafficking incur, is debt. So we're seeing children coming into this country with debts already incurred, right? And again, those vulnerabilities compounding, right? They're in a new country, now they have a debt, right? And then aside from that as well, we're seeing vulnerabilities around unaccompanied migrants. In migration in this region, right, we've definitely seen an increase reporting since 2018 in young children that are coming through borders and ending up in these situations. Some of the indicators and elements of force, fraud, and coercion that we're also seeing tend to mirror what we see in adults in some cases. In some cases they're similar, in some cases they're different. It's similar in the same type of economic coercion that we're seeing again, right? And so by economic coercion, again, it can be debts, but it can also be withholding of wages of children, right? So children are, again, coming in debt, they're working, but they have to pay something off, they're getting their debt withheld. An element of force, fraud, and coercion that we have also seen more with minors than with adults is an element of emotional coercion. That's usually something that is reported with adults, but definitely something that comes up more in the data, right? And that can be manipulation. Of course, these are young children, right? So it can be manipulation, abuse, and then all the other indicators that we see, right? Threats, right? Whether it's, all sorts of threats, even threats of deportation. So all those other elements are present in these conditions. And so I think for us, really, the important part is, again, getting at those systems, right? How do we start reforming the systems that allow this to happen, that a lot of times are shared with the systems that adults learn, right? They're sharing those spaces, right? They're in the same plants as, meat packers. So it's important to also think about the issue holistically. And sort of maybe a question I pose too is, when we talk about child labor, what is the connection with adult forced labor, right? When conditions are so poor for adults, what does that mean for children in those spaces, right? And what is that connection? How can that make a child more vulnerable? So I think I'll leave it there.
Great, yes, thank you. Rachel, what are you seeing?
Well, actually seeing a lot of what Deanna had said in terms of the issues around isolation, language access, lack of services and supports, and certainly debt is a major issue. And the one thing that I would add is where we're seeing cases of child labor and forced labor, they're often in plants where they are using staffing agencies. And so, for example, Reuters did an expose on child labor in the Hyundai and Kia plants. And we are bringing a class action against Hyundai and Kia for wage and hour, fraud, and other violations on behalf of guest workers, TN workers, visa holders who are employed in those same plants. And so just generally, like, what we're seeing is this role of staffing agencies being really significant in all of the industries where we're seeing cases of child labor.
Right, yeah. And Marlon, what are you seeing in terms of these global trends that you've worked on for years and how it's manifesting here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that it's very much the similar things that we see that we have seen in the countries that we have been working in Asia. We see, as you mentioned, is the recruitment, excessive use of recruitment agencies that are not monitored properly. It's insufficient visibility into the supply chains. It is over-reliance on subcontractors, and then we have this vulnerable population in this mix. So I think that companies that were named in the article and that are here in the US, I think that many of them can use their learnings and the best practices from the work that they have been doing in other global sourcing countries, because it's very much the same, right? I know the context is different, and we can talk at length about weak legislations and weak enforcement, but that's in many other sourcing countries as well, right? That's nothing that is very specific for the US. So I think that there are a lot of learnings. Companies do have a lot of policies and procedures in place on how to handle these issues and how to deal with unauthorized subcontracting. So I would urge all companies to look into that, look what you have. Use them also here in the US, because it's clear now that this is a high-risk country. We have similar issues that we're seeing everywhere else. And then I would like to address, again, the elephant in the room. And I'm also saying that because on Monday it was the International World Day of Child Labor, right? Which we have now but we have commemorated that for 10, 12 more than years. And we were having a series of webinars and we were discussing and so forth, and I was thinking to myself, am I going to sit here in 20 years' time on the World Day of International Child Labor? No, now I'm done. This has to be it, right? So it's also an urge to companies to look into your business practices, your sourcing practices. It comes down to that very, very often. We have vulnerable children, we have a lot of issues, sponsor program that doesn't work as well. But please, see your own role in this. See the link between your business operations, the way you do your purchasing, the way you put your orders, and see your role in this. And there are a number of things that all of us can support you with in that. And I think it's also a matter of acknowledging that we have these challenges, because if we can't talk about it openly, then it's very difficult to address them. So I think we all know that this is a challenge. We need to address them, and we have tools for that. So let's get started.
Great. Louise, you mentioned you have obviously American members as well as companies from other parts of the world. How much of a sense of American exceptionalism is the elephant in the room?
I have to be honest, it hasn't been part of the conversations we've been having. Like, a couple of people have asked me about that, as we've been talking together, and I think the response, from my perspective, the response from members, I think, has been a mature one. We haven't, we have been focused on what do we do next and what do we do next together. We haven't had conversations about sending out questionnaires to suppliers or auditing. We've said we know that we need to do more than that. I think the lessons, there are always more lessons we could learn from around the world, Marlon, so I totally take your point. But again, I think, the fact that there is experience of this issue in a different form, in forced labour form from the UK, from Europe, is actually really helpful, because it's something we can build on and we can say, let's not go down the compliance route. So the next steps that we are looking at and we're exploring together are about a lot of the things that, Marlon just touched on, which is how do we build understanding of this issue with those areas where there's more exposure to risk, so with labour providers or service providers or suppliers further down the supply chain. How do we increase the understanding of the causes of these risks? How do we try and build trust and openness? What role can those companies have in trying to open up the conversation about risk? And I think it's a big challenge for me. I guess the elephant in the room is what we need to see is more openness that these issues are out there. We need to see workers speaking up and saying, I'm worried about someone else on the factory floor, I'm worried that they're vulnerable, whether they're a child or an adult, I'm worried about them. You need suppliers in the supply chain opening up to their customers and saying, we have a challenge and we need to find a solution to that. Do we have the right culture for that at the moment? Do we have the right atmosphere? I'm not so sure about that one, but again, if I go back to my experience from the UK, there's always a case that sticks with me, which was there's a programme there. I don't know if Veronica from Stronger Together is here today, but she was here yesterday. There you are. Sorry, Veronica. So Stronger Together run a programme in the UK. It's been in existence for 10 years now. Part of that is about training workers and supervisors on site to recognise the signs of forced labour. As a result of that, at a Christmas party in a manufacturing site, this is in agriculture, this is food manufacturing, workers said to one of their colleagues, we weren't able to come to the Christmas party last year because the person who trafficked us locked us into our room and said we couldn't come. And so their colleagues raised that issue through the appropriate channels, and those people were able to kind of access help. And in a really kind of simplistic way, that's what we need to be able to kind of create, is this culture of openness where these issues do get opened up. But there are, and we'll get to public policy, there are lots of issues about doing that. But just on a very practical level, has been our focus. Is there is an element of oversight and there will need to be some transparency, but the conversation has been a mature one about engagement. It has touched a little bit on the financing question, probably not enough, but that link into purchasing practices, I always think there's more that we need to do in that area, and we kind of acknowledge that, but it has touched on that a little bit. So
great. As I mentioned before, we really wanted to spend some of our time talking about what remedy and remediation and justice looks like in this circumstance. Obviously, we know there's a long way to get to that point, but if we're not talking about it now and planning for it and identifying resources, then this is just going to be slower. So we're eager to hear from each panelist about how you're conceptualizing what remediation and remedy and justice looks like for these children and also the adults that may also be part of this in the specific U.S. context.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I think it looks in a lot of different ways. I think obviously the most obvious one is paying workers what they're owed, right? I think that it just goes without saying, right? So there's obviously, even in that part, a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. I'm sure Rachel can talk more to it, but right now, the U.S. Department of Labor has created a partnership with the Mexican Secretaría de Bienestar to return and find workers and be able to give them back wages, right? And so that's a very key, obviously an important part. But when we, I'm thinking sort of what remuneration we have here in the U.S. and for children, and I go back to part of what we do on the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and when we hear of children, we're mandated reporters, and so that immediately goes to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the Office of Family and Children, and there's a mechanism called an eligibility letter, right? And what that gives access to children for is basically if they're if a child meets a certain criteria and they might experience trafficking, this opens up some possibilities for them. And that includes access to services, access to specific case management. It opens up services to medical services, food assistance. So basically, the same services as a refugee, and that is important, right, for children who we detect to be able to have that access through the work that we do.
Rachel?
Yeah. I would agree on the enforcement of minimum wage and other wage protections, and just general working conditions for workers. The concerns or the issues that we've seen, I think probably lots of us are familiar with them, have been the implications for workers through mandatory reporting sometimes, which can create accessibility and eligibility for benefits, but can also cause harm in some instances, family separation and other issues. And so, you know, for us, like, we're really focused on ensuring that workers' rights as a whole are protected. And I think it's really important to take that into account too, because the child labor provisions are also, there's no private enforcement. And so our approach really is trying to protect the rights of workers to their wages and to other protections at work, health and safety.
If I may just kind of compliment Rachel's or just comment, I think that at the end of the day, that's the game plan, right? Because if workers' rights are protected, right, it doesn't have to get to that level, right? And so, to what Louise was saying, right, in that environment where, you know, there can be reporting of maybe things that are in child labor, but or of conditions that are subpar, it doesn't get to that, right? It doesn't get to that continuum of exploitation, where kids end up in this way. So it's very important, very key to just start with that as a basis, right? And then when it gets to these extremes, then, you know, there's different mechanisms. So.
Great. Oh, and you referenced earlier that there are protocols that companies have in place, how they've dealt with the problem when children have been found in their supply chains. How do you see that operating here in the U.S.?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just as every child labor case is different, all the remediation solutions also needs to be different. So last year we remediated 301 cases of child labor, which was our record year. A very sad record, but that shows how the situation is. And not a single one was a similar one. So we do remediation case by case. We're one of the few organizations that are doing that. It's a girl or a boy that's found in an industry or in a farm that gets sort of a personalized remediation program, because all kids then have the right to remedy when they have been sort of under harm, and that means that they should also not lose out economically on that. So we're providing a living stipend to the child and the family, so which is the same level as the minimum wage, and then we discuss with the child what their aspirations are for the future. What do they want to do? Can they go back to school if they have dropped out, or should we try to find a vocational training program? And this is, of course, very individual based. And then people say, yeah, but we have 50 kids here on a farm. We can't do that for every 50 kids. No, maybe not. We need to find other solutions. So that's also what we are working on now with a number of our brands and clients, to find sort of solutions where we have a large group of kids. And very often, so we have, I mean, child labor is also, it's below minimum age, right? Kids that are not allowed to work. But it's also children that are allowed to work, but there are young workers. And for the young workers, there are specific regulations in place that they shouldn't do hazardous work and so forth. But they have the right to work. So just to say that they shouldn't work means that they will find work somewhere else, in the informal sector, or in tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4. So, I mean, and for them, when they are identified in hazardous work, it's a lot about providing them with decent work opportunities for youth. And I think that is one thing that we are discussing here with clients in the US. Because it's not that we can just say that, oh, we have to stop everything, kids, they have income enough, they shouldn't work. We need to find alternatives, right? So creating decent work for youth, where they are properly managed, where they have sort of managers that know how to set up decent working stations. Again, don't come to us and say, no, we can't have kids here because there's no work for them to do. We can always find the work for a youth that they can do. And we have shown that in various projects. So individual solutions, but we need also to find those broader solutions, decent work for youth. And this is something very, very sort of early on. So I know that, so a number of companies have now paid civil penalties here in the US for $1 million, I think it is now. So since I'm new to the US and I don't really know how US budget functions, I turned to Global Child Labor Coalition based in Washington. Some of them may know Reed Mackey, who is working on this. And I was asking, sorry, but where do this money go? Can you just, does it go into the big, very basic question? I know, but it's like, and he was like, yes, it's going into the federal budget. But he said that he and his network is now lobbying for some of these funds to go back to a kind of an emergency fund for remediation purposes. That will, of course, take years, and he said also it needs some legislations, but I just want to share this here and now, because I think that was a very interesting thought as well. And then finally, then everyone asked, so who pays for the remediation? Well, the company that we work with, they pay for the remediation, or their suppliers pay for the remediation. The remediation is in various parts: living stipend for the child, some education or activity for the child before it needs minimum age, and some money for us or another organization to do the monitoring and the reporting and the follow-up with the child and the family.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, it's interesting that possible solution with using the money echoes what honestly, as Sean was saying yesterday, about how fines that the Customs and Border Protection might levy could also be used for a fund for workers. So interesting idea that hopefully our colleagues from the U.S. government, I know there are at least one here, might explore. Louise, I know this is relatively early in the process for ING Progress, but when you talk about convergence of your members around approaches, what are you seeing that's likely to happen around remedy?
So I think, yeah, exactly as you said, it is early days. But I think, I mean, I suppose what I felt I could add to the comments is that there's kind of immediate, for me there's an element about immediate steps in terms of remedy. So, you know, the organisations represented on the panel are the ones that will be able to provide the support, the longer term remediation, and certainly companies need to make better connections, you know, whatever type of company it is, to know who to go to know where to get help for longer term remediation. But I also think kind of one of our areas of focus in the immediate term is about how do you make sure that workers, once identified, whether they are child or adult survivors of forced labour, how do they get access to remediation? And I go back to my experience of working with really seasoned human resource professionals in the UK who come across cases of forced labour. And, you know, exactly as you just said, Marlin, they might have come across, it might be their 5th case of forced labour, or it might be their 1st, but actually for them to be able to know, what do I do? Like, these signs are presented on site, I know that I need to do something, I know I need to do the right thing, because we know from a myriad of examples that doing the wrong thing pushes people underground and it makes the situation worse, and we don't want that to happen. So I think kind of an immediate step for us is to make sure that all those partners in the supply chain where there's a higher exposure to risk understand what is the thing that I need to do as my immediate first steps, what is responsible, how do we have a victim, sorry, I don't want to use that victim-centered approach, but how do we have a human-centric approach that says the first person I need to be concerned about is the child worker or the adult survivor of forced labour. How do I protect them, hear their story, respect their story, record their story, and then find ways to support them? And there are always those immediate steps of how do you find someone shelter or food, all of those things that need to be done in the 24 hours after you've identified there's a problem. And I think, you know, that for us is kind of our, in a way, what it feels like within our sphere of control. And then it's about being able to say to companies, and after that, you need to connect in with experts. You need to find out where the money's going to come from to support this and kind of the longer term steps. But yeah, that was just a reflection based on my kind of lived experience of working on this with suppliers in the UK.
Great, thanks. As many of you know, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, a major pillar of the activity has been public policy advocacy to use the power of businesses committed to responsible recruitment to reach out to countries, governments, and say, this matters for us, and you need to change your approach and your policies. So as we think about how businesses in this room and more broadly can and should advocate for policy difference, policy changes, what are the things that come to mind for you all?
I mean, definitely something that we're always hoping for is more enforcement, right, of just even the rules that exist. You know, there definitely needs to be more inspections of work sites, right, even just the number of inspectors. I forget the ratio, but you look at the ratio of inspectors to folks working, it's really not a sustainable model. So I think that for us is key to begin with. And for folks at the wage and hour, to be trained in what to look for, right? We encounter sometimes folks from these departments that, tell us I've been an inspector, but, we haven't had any training on this. So we're trying to look for this one thing. So it's kind of like just very focused on these issues, and a lot of times the issue can be right in front, but it's not noticed. And it goes to sometimes a lot of the misconceptions around human trafficking and forced labor and what that looks like. And for folks that are not as familiar with the issue, a lot of times they're thinking of coercion factors that involve somebody being tied or locked up, which can happen. But when we look at the factors of forced and coercion in these situations, it's obviously, as we've been speaking out for the past day and a half, it's much more in a way insidious than that, right? It can be in front of us, but it's somebody, again, who is in a bondage, right, and who has these conditions around them. So for us, I think that is just sort of the starting point, is to get more folks on the ground to be able to detect these cases.
Great. Rachel, you're a real expert in what kind of lobbying should be done around the guest worker program. Is there an angle there, or some other approaches that you're thinking of?
I mean, there's definitely an angle there, and certainly we have had minors in the H-2A program, and what we don't have is data that really disaggregates sufficiently by age. There's a large category that's like 15 to 19, which is a pretty big range, and we've actually seen a significant increase in the number of visas that have been issued to workers in that category, like in that age range. But it's not like disaggregated enough for us to be able to even have a sense of where those workers are, what age they actually are. Are they all 15-year-olds or 19-year-olds? And so certainly, like, on the transparency piece, I also like additional scrutiny on, the staffing and recruitment agencies and the entire recruitment chain would be important. Yeah, and of course agree with the recommendation for more enforcement of minimum wage and other worker protections. Yeah.
Great, thanks. What do you see in terms of policy advocacy that maybe has worked in other places that we might try here?
That's tricky. I mean, I do write child labor policies, but I'm not a policy person otherwise. But yeah, I think I would like to go back also to this. I think also businesses can lead right. Businesses can take the lead by practice. Look at how businesses are taking the lead in the transformation within environment, for example, in Europe, where we see private sector is leading. So I think here it's also in the human rights space, there is also an opportunity for responsible companies to take the lead, show that this actually can work. We can work on youth development programs and so forth. But I also think it comes back to training and education. We can see, for example, when we train auditors on child labor prevention, we can see that those auditors are detecting much more child labor than untrained auditors. That goes for labor inspectors as well. Train them on detection of child labor. But then equally important, and then going to what Louise says, is to train them on first response, right? Because there is so much harm if a child labor is detected and it's not taken care of, right? If a child, so that's even worsening the situation. So also train them in first response, how to talk to children in a responsible way, how to not scare them away, and then also have something. Then what's the solution? Okay, you have identified the kid. What do we do now? You can't just leave them there. So a lot of things can be done, I think, sort of at the state and the government level. But I think also we have a momentum a little bit. So let's not just wait for everyone else to do the job. I think let's work together and because we have a lot of experience, a lot of competence in this room. I think we can move the agenda forward.
Okay. Finally, well, I'm not necessarily putting this on the person representing business here. We know that many states in this country are relaxing, weakening their child labor laws, and also that businesses often been fighting against strengthening child labor laws in the U.S. at the federal level. For many of you who aren't from the United States, you may not realize that a lot of child labor in agriculture is legal here in the U.S. And so I'm just curious, any of you, but from you, Louise, if you have input on this, your sense of how much business is willing to step up to the plate and talk about those and advocate for a higher floor for children, as well as maybe strengthening rather than relaxing of state level laws.
Okay, so this is going to sound like I'm dodging the question, but I'm not trying to dodge the question. But genuinely, Progress, we're not an advocacy organisation, so I don't want to talk on something that we don't do, to be honest. I think what we're trying to work on is a practical programme through which we will be, and from the outset, happy to talk to anyone at that level about the programme and what we're trying to do, and to open that to anyone else from any other industry that wants to be part of it. But yeah, I don't want to pretend, Sean, that we have a platform on that. So
I understand,
pass on at
but
that point.
I just felt it was important to mention this because these are really important contextual factors.
Yeah.
Why don't we go to our questionnaire, our questioner extraordinaire, Bonnie, with the questions from the...
I'm afraid it's the less extraordinary one.
Okay.
It's Francesca. Bonnie's having a well-deserved break. So there are 3 questions, one that's already been answered, so 3 here, and just one that I have. I'm going to stay sitting down, so I need to get the wording right. I'm not well versed on this issue. It's very interesting, this panel, but one for me, I wonder if there are any positive examples of industry associations and state bodies that other states and industry associations can look at within the US, depending on if there are industries where child labour is more prevalent. And then 2 questions from the audience in the room that I guess can be taken together. What are the systemic issues that make it easier for employers to employ children as opposed to migrants via legal visa programs? And what programs other than fines to offenders are being used to prevent forced child labour? And then this one, I'm going to read this one because this is where I don't know it so well. So in terms of purchasing practices due diligence, have there been good examples, perhaps out of the UK or elsewhere, of companies moving more towards open book contracting, or at least sharing labour costing as non-negotiable part of service agreement between customer and client?
Okay, an interesting range of questions. Anybody want to take some of them? Perhaps Louise on that last question about the situation in the UK with open book?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had some examples of, I don't know if it counts as open, but we've certainly had some examples of ethical recruitment models, I think, on yesterday's panel. For open book costings, yes, there are some examples that I'm aware of from the UK. I don't think they're just in the UK. Examples in dairy, for example, a retailer that I worked with was doing that kind of 10 years ago, which I think is helpful. There's also, I'm not employed by Stronger Together, but sorry, just to reference some work that they've done, called the Fair's Fair campaign, which if people haven't seen it, is a UK-specific report, but it talks specifically about purchasing practices in labour recruitment supply chains, and talks about everything from payment terms through to penalties and other practices that cause problems for labour recruiters. And I think that's a really underutilised report and piece of research. It is UK, but I imagine it applies, would apply as much kind of in the US context. So yeah, a few examples.
Okay. Rachel?
Oh, I forgot I have one. What I would just mention about the first question in terms of positive examples, I don't really have any positive examples, but there are 10 states where we've seen efforts to weaken child labor protections in the last few years. And in a lot of those states, we've seen those efforts backed by protein processing industries, hospitality, construction, some of the same industries that are also pushing for, expansion of employer controlled guest worker programs. And so there's definitely some overlap in that regard too, and it's worth looking at. And we have a little chart, and also I would recommend, if folks are interested in that and the role that industry associations have played in the efforts to kind of weaken child labor protections, EPI has a nice report about this on their website, Economic Policy Institute. So we'd check that out.
And just to add to Rachel's comment, we're in tandem today. Those same industries are the ones that we're seeing reporting on the hotlines So it's a system, right? It's weakening the laws, right? It's from these same industries, and then we're seeing the reports on that end. So I think it sort of shows how it all sort of leads to that movement. Yeah.
Good. Other questions for us, Francesca?
There is one more question here. How do you think that the US government and governments of countries of origin of migrant children in child labour can work better together to prevent child labour, also considering that most child labour takes place in the informal sector?
Good question. So the issue of the informal sector and then the origin countries. Maybe, Rachel, you work a lot in Mexico and other origin countries. Any thoughts there?
Not a ton, honestly, but what I would say is, certainly supports through the consulates, and for workers, for young people who go to the consulates, that can definitely be a base of support, and also for returned workers who may have the need to claim their benefits and their the compensation that they're owed once they get home. So. I don't have, really strong recommendations on that, other than the ones that we would say should apply to all workers in terms of providing a base of support and services throughout the worker's experience, from recruitment to when they go home.
And it's a transnational issue, especially here in the U.S. when we look at the country of origin of a lot of the victims, right? Again, no surprise, right? Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And so a lot of that collaboration with country of origin is key. We also do a lot of work with consulates, right? I think somebody yesterday was talking a lot about trust, right? And so sometimes that initial step can be trusting your own government, right? Maybe you're not familiar with this country, but the consulates can sometimes be sort of an opening. We've done trainings for consular officials here in the U.S., but primarily Mexican consular officials, and they've already started detecting cases, right? Again, sometimes it's just knowing that it's there, right? And once they have that closeness, or maybe sharing those spaces, they're going to migrant detention centers, or people are coming in, they're able to grasp that, and get the ball rolling.
Okay, good. Any comments on the challenges or opportunities related to the informal sector? Alan, maybe?
Informal sector, yes. I don't know really what to say there, to be honest. I think we have a lot of issues in the formal sector that we need to address, and I don't say we shouldn't address the informal sector, but cleaning up the formal sector and provide decent work for all will also eventually clean up the informal sector, right, in a way. So I think it goes hand in hand, and I think it's also, again, I think one question was about systematic issues as well, and I think one of the things is also, again, know your supply chain, right? Unauthorized subcontracting. Very often it comes down then to informal sector partners down the line, so to say. So you need also to be aware of that, that you have, and do a mapping on your supply chain, know your risks, know who they are. We just recently worked in India with a brand who thought they had 10 subcontractors. It turned out that it was 106 when we did the mapping. So, and a lot of them were in the informal sectors. It's again getting that visibility into your supply chain.
I'm curious if there's some other comments that panelists want to make, particularly around the fact that these exposés have focused on sectors that in the past many people didn't think child labor was present or forced labor, right? So unfortunately people hear a lot of stories, a lot of documentation around child labor in agriculture, but they were talking about manufacturing plants, protein facilities, places like that. And I'm just curious if any of you want to highlight more some of the characteristics of those sectors that might enable participants here to better think about how they should approach that, where they may have been thinking about this issue in the United States primarily from an agricultural lens.
I'm happy to take that one. I mean, I think, again, I suppose I go back and think about my kind of UK experience, and I think about what are the jobs that are cold and wet, you know, and that can be a meat processing factory as much as it is in agriculture. What are the jobs where, you know, the average American or European doesn't want to work? And I think that is often, I can't speak for things like the automotive sector because it's not a sector that I've worked in, but, you know, in kind of FMCG and food, those are often the kind of sectors where I think you see risks, where it's difficult to, you know, part of this relates to, you know, the tightness of the labour market in the US and those kind of challenges of getting workers in. That is part of the kind of challenge. So I think, I mean, what I'd say is start from a position of assuming that the risk can apply everywhere. The filters that certainly I've always thought of and that we would talk to members about would be look at where you've got large percentage of temporary labour, whatever form that is in. I had an experience from household products. This goes back to UK retailer days where, you know, it was a very mechanised factory. It was producing cleaning products, but actually because the retailer that I worked for was doing promotions off and on for the brand, their volumes would go up exponentially every time the own brand product was on sale. So actually they had a flood of temporary workers coming in for a month-long period or a couple of week period. So that's a risk that you get because of purchasing practices, but you wouldn't necessarily associate that sector with high risk. So I think thinking about those filters, thinking about actually what's the volumes in the kind of sites, how many kind of temporary workers do we have in, what's the nature of the work, is it easy to recruit, yes or no, you know, what's turnover, what's absenteeism on sites, a lot of those kind of factors I think are the things that you need to build in rather than perhaps the kind of, you know, the global data does help, but you have to get more granular than that and look within countries, within regions, within states. You know, and Verite themselves have done some great work looking at state level, you know, where are there large numbers of displaced children. I think those kind of things are the things that you need to be looking at to really kind of unpick the risks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I had one other question, just really briefly. We've talked a lot over the past day and a half about European due diligence, the Tariff Act, not just here in the US, but in other countries that are starting up, Mexico, Canada, elsewhere. How much do you think this situation in the United States with child labor and forced labor is going to be seen, enforced, dealt with by those actors, which could put additional pressure on American companies?
Well, we hope definitely that it is, right? I think the Tariff Act is an important tool, but it's in thinking about you know, this issue. I think it kind of goes without saying, but the onus can't be on either workers or children, right? And so I know we're running out of time here, but it's to sort of sum up, right? It's about how all these different factors come in and play a role, right? And so, of course, workers should have a way to report and should be empowered to know their rights. But again, the onus can't be on them. They're already in difficult situations. And so a lot of the thinking is how do we move around those different systems or those different points in the system to be able to start creating that accountability. Yeah.
Right. Okay. There are no, Rachel?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we'll wind it up there. I know that we only have a half hour, I believe, for lunch. And so please join me in thanking our panel for this really insightful.